Okay, so today you should be finishing up section 2. You should have read some. You should have done some peer revision and read some of your classmates' work. I know there was some confusion about the difference between section 1 and section 2 and what things should go there. But section 3, I think, is going to be the easiest section. It's also going to be pretty short. This is a 2 to 3 page. I think our first section was 2 to 3 pages, but section 2 was a little bit longer. So let's just get right into this one. I think it's pretty straightforward. Section 3 is going to be recommendations or alternatives. So you're going to do a 2 to 3 page formal revised essay explaining what steps should be taken to improve the issue. No introduction or conclusion is necessary. Of course, it needs to be in paragraph form with appropriate APA citations, and all of the formatting remains the same. I think it is important to notice that it does need to be in paragraph form because the APA example on the sexualization of girls is definitely more in a list form, and I would like for yours to be in paragraph form because I'm a writing teacher and I'm trying to evaluate your writing. In some of your science classes or engineering classes, it may be appropriate to include lists and your professors may prefer that, but for a writing class, I have to evaluate your writing. So please do it in paragraph form. You may have heard of this kind of assignment before. This is a pretty common writing assignment in most composition classes. Typically, though, we call it a proposal. You are proposing something, some kind of solution or something be done. So if you want to think about this section 3 as its own little essay, and the type of essay that it is a proposal. You are going to explain how you would solve the problem. In each paragraph, you would have one step. That's going to be your evidence. And then you're also going to explain why you would do it this way, and that would be more like your analysis. So even if you're still uncertain about the evidence and analysis part, just remember that the purpose of this section is to explain how you would solve the problem and why you would do it that way. I would estimate for 2 to 3 pages, you're going to need 4 or 5 body paragraphs. I think usually there's like 2.5 paragraphs per page. So I would aim for that. 4 or 5 body paragraphs that explain exactly what your proposal is, what you're proposing. So you're going to talk about how you would carry out your plan, and each paragraph should include one major step or one major category. So if you want to think about this, we can look at the APA task force on the sexualization of girls. This one does include an introduction explaining what steps have already been taken. And so they talk about sort of what's been done in the past, what other proposals have been adopted. I think this is a really good way to look at all introductions, and that's why I bring it up. You know that this section does not need an introduction, so I had already said there's no introduction necessary, but as we are getting to the end of the document and thinking about the introduction for the full document, I do like to think about the introduction as kind of background information or historical context or something that explains what's happened up until this point, something that explains the past. I also like to think of the body as like the present. This is the situation right now. These are the things I'm advocating for in this moment. And then the conclusion, I like to think of as moving on to the future. What steps would you like to see happen? What is the call to action? What would the future look like? So that's just my own little side note about the structure of an essay. I like to think of the introduction as the past, the body as the present, and the conclusion as the future. So regardless, that was a little off track, but it does include an introduction that talks about what steps have already been taken. You do not need this, but the body explains what still needs to be done. So we're kind of focusing on the future here. They have broken it down very clearly into a bunch of different steps, into 5 different steps. So you're going to have about 4 or 5 body paragraphs. They have about 5 different sections. Their first one is research. Their second one is practice, but specifically they're talking about psychologists. We know that APA stands for American Associated or American Psychiatric Association. So that's one of their main focuses. But when they talk about practice, they're talking about mental health practitioners. So they want some research to be done. They want some practitioners to alter their practice. They want education and training. They want public policy and public awareness. So these are pretty easy to follow. I just want to point out a few things in each one that might help you start to come up with plans for your proposal. So they had step one was research. I do like that they provided some new ideas here. This is a new direction we would like to take things. There wasn't much in the body of the essay about different cultures, different religions, different races, anything like that. But one of the things that they brought up in the research, and also a little bit in the introduction, was we need to find out more about this new area. So think about new avenues that may need to be pursued, new directions that you might want to go. This one is also focused on a specific audience. If you want to think of a specific audience for your proposal, sometimes it really helps. So obviously the audience here is psychologists, but all of these proposals were aimed at that specific audience. You will probably have a completely different audience, but as you're starting out, it's important to think about maybe what new directions you could take and also who you want to take those different directions. So who exactly are you talking about? So I thought those were two pretty important things from section one. They talked about a million things. I would not expect you to talk about 13 different things in one section. In fact, if one of your topics was research, I would expect this to be a single paragraph. So you would have a topic sentence that mentions research. You would have maybe a little bit of evidence about the new areas that you would like to pursue, and then you would have an analysis sentence that explains why you would do that and what the benefit of that would be. Okay, so their step two was moving on to practitioners. I didn't notice too much groundbreaking here that would be super helpful. They only had two small subheadings there. Step three, though, was about education and training. And I think this is just as important as audience. They consider the major stakeholders. And in English, we have a phrase that goes like this. You have something at stake. So, for example, maybe you would hear people having a conversation and they would say, you don't need to be part of this conversation because you don't have something at stake here. And something at stake means that you have something to gain or lose. So I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with that, but this is a pretty common phrase that we use. Stakeholders. Who are the people who hold a stake, who have something to gain or lose in this disagreement or this conversation? And I believe, if you want some background, it came from the gold rush that we had in the United States, where at the turn of the century, there were a lot of people mining for gold. And you were able to go to sort of uncharted areas. And if you put a stick or a stake in the ground, you were claiming that ground as your own. And when there was any kind of dispute over who owned a particular plot of land, they would have all of the stakeholders, all of the people who had planted a stake or a stick in that ground, have a discussion or solve it in some way. So the stakeholders are all of the people who have a claim or something to lose there. So I would consider this in your essay, considering who would benefit or gain, or who would lose something from any of these proposals that you're making. Step four, this is where I would typically expect to see, these are the typical arguments I would expect to see in a proposal. This is where they start to talk about funding. So for most solutions in real life, there's going to be some kind of money necessary for things to change. If you're doing a typical lab experiment, of course, it might not, recommendations and alternatives might not focus on money, but most proposals include cost or funding. And then public awareness. This was the first one where they actually broke it down into smaller parts. So they have their first point, and then they talked about sub-points there. And I would look at this kind of like a miniature, like I would look at this as a paragraph. So they've got a topic, and then they've got some details about that topic. This was the first one where they actually started to build out these smaller points. So these are just a few things that you might want to consider while you're looking at your proposal. You might want to think about new directions that the research or the information can go. You might want to think about who exactly you want to take these steps, because that will help you narrow down the steps. You might think about who has something to gain or lose here, because that's going to have a big effect on the steps that are taken. You might want to consider cost or funding that's necessary. Another thing that's common is like time or effort. These are things that you might be interested in getting as part of your steps. And then of course, each one of these you want to break down into a smaller part and give details in your paragraph. So your homework for today is going to be to outline the recommendations or alternatives section. If you want to think about it like this, I think this is maybe a little bit easier to understand than all of this. So I just sort of simplified it down here at the bottom for you. In your outline, you might put step 1, and then you would explain in just a short phrase what that step is. Give some details about it. You can have like an A, B, C here. You can, just have 1 or 2. And then at the end, your analysis, which is why do you think this step is important? What is the overall purpose of this step? Why are you doing it this way instead of another way? So if you want to use this little format for your outline, that is totally fine. If you have questions about this, please bring them to class and we can talk about them. And I will see you guys soon.